to kick us off. I'm going to pass it over to Shamubeel on a great panel, I'm sure. Kick it off.
Amazing. Thank you, Avril. Look, I'm really excited to have these two amazing guests with me today. The topic of our discussion today is poverty and the economy, and it's quite a big topic. And I really want to invite two people who are dealing with, I guess, a very sharp end of poverty, but also somebody who's dealing with people who are falling out of relative comfort into poverty or at the risk of. So I've got these two amazing guests. My first guest is Helen Robinson, and she's the city missioner at the Auckland City Mission. If any of you haven't seen Helen on the Q&A interview that she did, it's a must-watch. Go look it up. Amazing. But it's also because she understands how poverty works and worked with it for so much of her life and is dealing with how to actually do something about it and look after people. So Helen, welcome. Absolute pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Shamubeel.
And Sasha, I think we met maybe a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. I can't remember, but Sasha was just 3. Oh my goodness. Sasha was just at the beginning of starting Money Sweetspot, and Sasha's had an amazing journey, and we'll pick up on side to actually coming to going, there are people who need access to good quality financial services that's affordable and I guess full of empathy and care. And so she's gone off and started something of her own, which is Money Sweetspot, with the backing of some amazing people. And so I'm really excited to have Sasha here because Sasha kind of lives and breathes the delivery of a solution for people who are experiencing, I guess, distress, might be falling out of relative comfort and poverty. And that's really, really exciting. Now, for me, I'm an economist. I'm not going to be doing a lot of talking today, but I'm going to be managing some of the conversation today. And my background is as an economist. While economists are kind of talking heads and all that kind of stuff, I may be a little bit different in that I actually care about the distribution and people who are behind it. Because fundamentally, the economy is not about the economy out there, but it's about how do we make more people better off. And I feel like we've lost sight of that. So we'll try and have that conversation today. So in the chat there, you've got a little bit of information about the Auckland City Mission. Please go and have a look, a search of Sweet Money Spot, and you'll get some really great information about what the kaupapa of the organization and where it has come from. But anyway, that's enough intros. Just drop us a chat if you need anything. And we can get started on in terms of just how are we going to kind of deal with and frame up this conversation. The startling statistic for me is that there is something like 400,000 households in New Zealand who say they don't have enough money. That's an extraordinary number of people, extraordinary number of families who are experiencing that. And I might start with Helen. And Helen, you're kind of seeing the very sharp end of poverty, but what does poverty look like in your experience with what you are seeing in places like Homegrown?
Thank you, Shamubeel, and lovely to be doing this with you too, Sasha. It's acknowledgement to you and to everyone on the call. Tēnā koutou katoa. Pleasure to be here with you today. Shamubeel has spoken about, there's a super quick reference to the Auckland City Mission there. Just to give you a kind of 3-second elevator pitch so that you've got a sense of the context of who we are so I can begin talking. We are an organisation that's 103 years old, based here in central city Auckland. So I am talking to you from a stone's throw from Sky City, literally throw a stone and it hits Sky City. Our kaupapa is to respond to the face of suffering and desperation in central city Auckland, and we've sought and attempted to do that for 100 years. And really our purpose or existence is to respond to people who nobody else is, or to really, as Shamubeel said, be at that hard edge of need actually in our country. And it's that kind of place or position that I can have authenticity or both ability and responsibility to talk from. At the moment, there are 3 areas that we're deeply connected to and in. One is access to healthcare. So when Shamubeel asked me that question in terms of poverty, what do we see? We have both a primary healthcare centre here and a detox unit. And I think the clear message that comes out of there is that people who are deeply suffering are struggling to get access to both primary health care and access to people who have services that genuinely respond to people who have a problem with alcohol or any other drugs. By and large, we say people are bad, so we put them in prison instead of actually acknowledging the health issue that it is. So that's one really big issue that's super, super concerning, to not be able to have access to primary health care. And in fact, between those two services, the mission funds up to $1 million a year to keep them going. So we are funding, and Auckland is funding services because our country isn't. The second that we're often quite well known for is our response to housing. And we have a whole raft of services in both emergency housing, or accessing emergency housing, transitional housing, and permanent housing. And it's not rocket science, and I'm not telling you anything you don't know to tell you that there are lots of people who don't have homes. But it is as simple as that. And one of the conversations Shamubeel and I have often had is that if New Zealand can't come to grips with providing appropriate, affordable housing, then actually you are just growing our future clientele. So there have been conversations where I have had with different people that said, thank you, you are just ensuring the existence of the Auckland City Mission in the future. Obviously said in jest, because the thing that I would love to do is not to have to be providing housing. So we have a very special service here where we are working with people who have been street homeless for a number of years. Now, by the time you become street homeless, what you have is years and years of a system that's failed you. So bluntly, we are failing our people, and we have a very particular kind of kaupapa or mission at the moment that we are failing women. 50% of New Zealand's homeless population are women, and we have services that I can count on one hand throughout our country that are dedicated for women, and women, of course, bring children with them. So our services are by and large designed for the single man, yet 50% of homeless people are women with children. So you can see the madness. Then finally, and I'll hand over to Sasha because I'm conscious I'm speaking lots, we have a huge program, sadly, that is dealing with people who are hungry. So this is one of the great shadows of our country at the moment, our absolute refusal to acknowledge the depth and extent of food insecurity in our country. So we believe that 20% of New Zealand is food insecure, so 1 in 5 of us. We believe that parts of South Auckland, that's close to 40%. So 1 million people in New Zealand today do not have access to enough resources to have enough good kai. So the City Mission in the last year distributed 50,000 food parcels with its partners. So every one of those 50,000 food parcels feeds a family of 4 for 3 meals for 4 days. So when I'm saying these numbers, I'm not making it up. Again, it is women who are bearing this burden of poverty, and particularly Māori and Pacific women. So poverty in our country has both a colour and it has a gender. So very, very quickly we're taken to those structural drivers, and we're showing what we value and what we don't value in our country. So that's poverty from my point of view, Shamubeel.
Thanks, Helen. And the thing that also comes to me, Helen, is there is also place in poverty. We have poverty that's urban, we have poverty that's rural, and they're not the same. They're very, very different things. And when I came and visited you at Homeground and you gave us the tour, what really struck out for me was, yes, there's poverty, but there's also hope. Yes. That we can do something about it. And I think the part of the conversation today is not to be just depressed about this stuff, because it is depressing. But the reality is, I think I saw in the chat, with a country of 5 million people, we can actually totally solve this. It is within our grasp to be able to solve this. And that's the purpose of this conversation today. I might invite Sasha in, because Sasha, I think, some of the poverty that you're dealing with is probably more people who are falling out or falling into poverty or at the risk of poverty. So it'd be really great to hear your experiences over time with what you're doing now, but also what you saw before.
Yeah, cool. Kia ora, everybody. I want to start with a really short sentence that I've decided that is the grounding in which I see the world. So I believe that people are good, and I believe that bad things can happen to any of us. But I think that systems are set up to judge people for what life inherently is, which is unpredictable. So what I see is that an unpredictable life event, somehow people become bad, or it's their fault, you know, and we must be better because it hasn't happened to us. And I used to talk about that when I first met Shamubeel 3 years ago. I'd say that, and COVID hadn't happened, you know, and the unfortunate circumstance of COVID is that people didn't other the shared collective pain of COVID. Had pilots not flying in the sky and their income going down. So as a bit of a background, Money Sweetspot was born out of my inherent dislike of the judgment of people, particularly around financial services and debt. What I saw that was that debt could be a defining moment in a family's life for many generations, rather than debt being able to be worked through. So that came to the creation of Money Sweetspot as a place where we help people through debt and on with life in a place of non-judgment, using the power of empathy. So in terms of poverty in the service that we provide, we kind of, it's the women as well. So we've got some real themes around people taking on sexually transmitted debt is a big theme that's coming through for us at the moment, and balancing the responsibilities of family life and taking on the responsibilities of children. And I think over the last 3 years for me, there was a perception of what it was to be in poverty, and I've seen that definitely shift. People who are families that are both working, a couple of kids, renting, and life is getting really, really tricky, and an unpredictable life event, an unpredictable, unexpected expense can be the reason that people go from juggling those financial balls to struggling and then distressed. And really what I've seen over the last 3 years is an increase in people who are in that struggling place across New Zealand. And I think that from a societal perspective, the people that need help now haven't necessarily reached out for help before and don't know where to go. I spoke to Christchurch City Mission a few weeks ago, and they've had an increase in people who are working coming for food banks. So making a decision between your rent and food and not knowing where to turn. So I think there's a really a shift in the face of vulnerability and what it is to be in poverty in New Zealand.
Yeah, Sasha, can you give us a rough feel for, you know, the people that are experiencing this trouble? What kind of incomes are they on? I mean, is it like terribly low incomes, or is it also people on what we would consider, say, middle income?
Yeah, middle income. Yeah, so the average income of our customers is kind of around the 65, can be over 100,000 for a family. So it's kind of not the 35,000 low income family. It's middle New Zealand. And I think from a financial services perspective, what I've noticed is that the bigger players, if you like, have reduced their risk appetite to support those people, because they want to kind of stay with the prime credit, I think. And there's this bigger widening gap in the middle, and more people are falling into it with nowhere to go for responsible financial products or ways to work through a financial situation that maybe they've never faced before.
Yeah, I did some work on people with problem debt a couple of years ago, and what really came through was just how much shame there is, how much whakama there is just to kind of ask for help. So there is a real barrier to seeking help, even though there is some help available. But the help that's available is not easy to get to. The funnel is very confusing. And quite often the quality of the, as you know, quality of the services that are available are not always good. Quite often they can be traps themselves. Yeah. And so there's this extraordinary kind of situation. But if I can just touch on something with both of you, and to me, it's the sense that the face of poverty in New Zealand seems to be changing. It seems to be creeping higher and higher up in terms of the income brackets. Helen, you know, you've been working around poverty for a long time. Has the face and experience of poverty changed over time from what you have seen?
I think there's a yes and a no to that I kind of need to land on. and it feels like there's two conversations going on at the moment, and I just want to acknowledge those two. One is a description of almost the facts that's going on, the kind of people you're seeing, Sasha, the reality they're experiencing, the kind of people that we see here at the mission, and many great organisations throughout our country see, actually. And then I think there's this overlay that's actually saying, how are we as a society both constructing our response to that? And is that helping or is it hindering? And I think I just, before I kind of land into that question, Shamubeel, I just want to pick up, Sasha, on what you were saying, that one of my roles, I believe, is to, as accurately and as bluntly as I can, describe what I am seeing or we are seeing through this organisation more broadly, because in that accuracy and directness, there is a fact that is unequivocal. We can't move from that. Then there is an understanding that the constructs are not helping. So, Sasha, one of the things I often say is that through our systems, we're condemning people to being poor. This is never the fault of the individual. It is always a system driver, always. And then, ironically, or with tragedy, we condemn them for being poor. So we're saying, we're making you poor, and then we're saying you're bad because you are. Now, both the construct of the two, or making someone poor, the system, and then condemning them for it, neither is helping. And what we can do, we actually need to address the judgment around it to actually get to the real issue. And I think, Shamubeel, this links to what you were saying. I really back us in our country. I have the privilege of seeing the generosity and the extraordinary creativeness and guts of our country. Like, we are courageous, incredibly gifted people. At the same time, we're extraordinarily judgmental and harsh on each other. So if we can actually land in a space where we see what is in front of us, we do have both the resources and the skills to construct an alternative. Now, that's the kind of the beauty and the tragedy that I think really will be one of the themes of today. And it is quite a privilege to be with the 80, 90 of you here, people I understand who are really trying to get into that space of what is the reality and how do we move us through, because the moving us through actually does take a collective and a kind of tipping point of people who will actually say, we have constructed it this way, we can construct it another way. Now, I think, Shamubeel, to what you were saying before, really, I think, and again, I'm telling you something you all know, the late 80s, early 90s marked a shift in our world, in our country, how we constructed our responses, both through government and then more broadly in the corporate sector, that has meant at that point that what we as a kind of country are asking of our government to respond to people. Now, what then has happened now 30 years later is that we are seeing the long-term decisions of those policies, really. So you have a policy where you don't give a single mother enough money to raise children. There is both immediate impacts to that, but there is also long-term impacts to that. And we're starting to see some of those long-term impacts that mean, for example, for 30, 40 years, we just haven't built enough houses. So it means housing and homes are becoming more scarce. So it just means that it goes up the income ladder. So in 20, 30 years ago, if you were on a very low income, unless you accessed social housing, you weren't going to get a house. Now, what's actually happening is you can be on 70, 80, 90, 100K, and you actually don't have enough money to access affordable homes. Now, we know, and many people are a lot more clever than me, is that you could actually frame New Zealand's poverty issue just all around housing. It's the big ticket item that until we get that sorted, actually the impact of poverty gets stretched. So what we see here on a day-to-day basis, people coming in for food, actually their big ticket item is rent or the mortgage. And so Shamubeel, to answer your question in a very long-winded way, is yes, the breadth or the extent of poverty is increasing so that more people on higher incomes, Sasha, are experiencing it. Now, the one brief no that I have to have is that poverty is structural. We're saying as a country, women are less, Māori and Pacific people are less. So we are saying that if you're a woman, you're not as good as a man. If you are Māori or Pacific, you are not as good as Pākehā. So therefore, what that means is that if you are a woman or Māori or Pacific, you are going to be suffering and bearing the burden more. That truth still exists. That hasn't changed.
Thank you, Helen. And I think that I can see that in the data. I mean, being a geek, that's what I kind of look at. And essentially, New Zealand had addressed its income inequality quite well in the post-war era when we built the welfare state. And then, of course, we broke our government system and our public policy system in the 80s. And the promise was that that increase in inequality would come down once things got better, but it never did. So we've condemned people to this poverty. We've condemned ourselves to not having enough homes. And, when my wife and I wrote Generation Rent 8 years ago, our hope was that we would at some point start to see progress on the housing front at least. And we are starting to see some progress, but God, it's slow. It's too slow. And, the crisis that we're seeing in terms of the poverty, so much of it is, the uncertainty of housing, as well as the big issues that we see around, I think, even people with mortgages now facing these big increases that's really putting them on the edge. Sasha, I might come to you in terms of your experiences over time working in financial services. How has that kind of experience of poverty changed? But specifically for you, can you talk to us a little bit about how expensive it is to be poor?
Oh my gosh. The underserved and underbanked pay more for their debt. And if you can't afford to repay the debt, you get charged for. Just seems ludicrous, doesn't it? So I used to be the COO of a large finance company here in New Zealand. It's one that you would all know. And before that, I worked for the Serious Fraud Office as a forensic accountant. I used to put people in prison for financial services fraud. And the reason I'm sharing those two things with you is that you can imagine my surprise when I go and be on the exec of a finance company of some of the lovely revenue streams that finance companies are able to make out of people who need to access finance. So from my context, at the moment, New Zealanders, it's not unusual for people with lower incomes to be paying over 30% interest on any debt facility they take on. It's also not unusual for it to be over 50% interest. On top of that, the application fees, monthly fees, admin fees, default interest if you miss a payment, it can double the cost of that debt quite easily. It's mind-blowing. So that's when we set up Sweetspot, that's why we don't charge the monthly account fee. We don't charge default interest, because if people are missing payments, how stupid is it to then make that debt larger? So it is more expensive to be poor in New Zealand. And if we see people needing to access funds for an emergency, a root canal, the car blew up, I can't get to work without paying the car. I will find the money somewhere, but I don't have the mythical emergency savings account, because who does in this environment actually? So I go to wherever will say yes. The place that will say yes is likely to be charging is a high cost credit facility. That debt then becomes defining in a person's life and for that family. And it becomes something that they never get out of.
And Sasha, but is that new? Hasn't it always been the case that it sucks to be poor, that it's expensive, you don't have services that are designed for you, right? I mean, is it really new, or is it just it bites more? Like, what's changed?
Yeah. So there's a couple of things. So I don't think it's new, but I think that in the last few years there's been so much political. This is being recorded. Political tennis batting around the legislation that governs financial services that was intended to protect people from predatory lenders, but conversely, it excluded people from accessing financial products. So the intention was really good around some legislation change, but what it actually did was meant that more and more lenders needed to say no to people that previously they would have been able to say yes to. And I know that that sounds strange, but I think that that meant that people were kept in high cost credit facilities. So they had to stay with the 50% interest, even if they could go somewhere else and it may have been 10%, they weren't allowed out of that contract in some of the legislative changes that happened. So fortunately, some of that's being unwound now. So it's a problem that's existed for eons, but I think that the macroeconomic environment is impacting that, and also some of the legislative ping pong that's been happening over the last few years around the CCCFA.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the problem for me is we seem to have this uncoordinated response. Quite often we'll try and protect the poor by making the very poor worse off. We might have a legislation to stop something happening, but we don't offer a counter in terms of a way for people to still access credit, right? There is no, we didn't build a new thing that say, if
or
you
it not
can't
be
access
credit,
it,
you know, or not require credit. To Helen's point, you know, accessing healthcare so that you're not going to credit because you need a thing, you know. So I think it's about joining those approaches together. So you know, obviously I don't think debt's bad. I think debt's a tool if you're choosing to use it for something that's aligned with you know, a want that you have. I'm not going to say that debt shouldn't exist. That's not my belief. But I do think that we need to acknowledge that when things happen in people's lives, they should be able to access God-given right to healthcare without needing to end up in debilitating debt.
and I think from both of you, we know what the underlying thing is. Poverty is what poverty is that you don't have enough income. And you can solve that by giving people more income, but you have to want to. I think you kind of started on it, Sasha, and I'm far less careful when it comes to politics. I think our politics is fundamentally broken, right? Our politicians are all going, what can we do for the squeeze middle? Well, bugger the squeeze middle. What about the poor? Right. And it's kind of like, it's extraordinary that this entire political spectrum is built around trying to appease the middle. And we do it at the cost of the vulnerable and the poor. And I mean, vulnerable is not even the right word. These are the people who survive despite not having enough. They're probably the hardest in our communities. But our politics is kind of fundamentally broken in not having the heart and empathy that you talked about. Now, don't let it get me started on politics because it'll get me angry, because I want us to move into a slightly more positive space. And I want to start on the positive space because both of you are also working on solutions. And I want to touch on those because there are clearly ways for us to deal with this stuff. And Helen, I wonder if we could start with you, just in terms of a little bit of your experience of building home ground and what works there, because, what I saw there was just so, I don't know, it was uplifting. It gave me hope.
Yeah, and it's lovely to hear. I think one of the things I want to say is that some of the answers to some of the tricky stuff that's going on, while it's complex, it's not rocket science. It's actually very doable. Assuming we build in some things like some good evaluation and some thoughtful care around the delivery of services and products, and then a kind of open disposition that says, okay, that didn't work, but that did work. So when you kind of have that disposition, I actually think it is possible. And Homeground itself is a really, really good example. So this is a 11-story facility that we have here in Central City, Auckland. We have 80 permanent houses in this facility. That's 5 of those floors, including a rooftop. We have 2 floors of a detox unit, one run by Te Whatu Water and one run by ourselves. And then on our ground floor, we have a whole range of services, including a primary healthcare centre and a service called Hayata, where people can come for one good meal a day. Now, just to get a sense of that, on a busy day, we can have 300 people through in a 3-hour period. So that shows you in Central City, Auckland, how many people literally do not have any money for food and or are homeless. So, and that's quite separate than our food security program, which is run out of other sites. So Homeground is a beautiful building, and we designed it to be beautiful because it was an act of justice. It said our most poorest deserved the best. We worked hard not to be ostentatious, so it's not over the top, but it is beautiful. And the whole building, including the apartments and the medical centre and the detox units, are designed with the intention and need of the need. So we literally just sat down and said, if we want to house 80 people, what's it going to look like? And the litmus test as we worked our way through, bluntly, was that people like me would have to be happy to live there permanently. So it's just kind of your ordinary person test that actually says what is needed. And then there's some thoughtfulness in that. And to be fair, it's taken us 16 years to get here. So this is not an overnight job, team. The cost of Homeground, if you kind of hold your chairs for a moment, was $110 million. We started with $8 million in the bank. This is the biggest capital fundraising campaign for an NGO in New Zealand's history currently. About 18 months, I received the last $5 million of that $110 million. So we opened Homeground debt-free. New Zealand did that for us. So we had 8 million to start with. So the balance of that, just over $100 million, is what our country gave us. So now we worked hard to get it, but it shows you what is possible and actually just how generous New Zealand is. So through that, what that means is 80 people now have a home who this time last year, we housed our first person on the 11th of April last year, didn't have a home. And what's incredibly important, in particular about Homeground, is 40 of the 80 people in here are part of the Housing First program. So very bluntly, you've got 1 year on the street to qualify, a minimum of, and 2 comorbidities. So you're physically unwell, you're mentally unwell, you have an active addiction, you're cognitively impaired. This is designed for people who haven't been able to be sustainably housed elsewhere. And we're doing it here. Now, we've learnt loads in 18 months, and it's not easy, but the critical message is here, it's possible. The story of Homeground is, and just even in that little housing bit, is the provision of adequate, affordable housing with appropriate support for people who have the highest level of need in our country. It can be done. And it can be done when all of us do that together. So that's a lot of people. I talk about this building being made of brick and wood, but actually it's made in the generosity and courage of our country. It's a truth that does exist.
Helen, can I just ask, do we have those conversations about the costs of being homeless? You know, it's extraordinarily expensive, even from just a government perspective, leaving aside society and the individuals. Just from a government perspective, there's a huge fiscal cost of having homeless people.
Totally. And in
versus
fact, yeah, sorry, Shamubeel, you keep going.
I'm just asking, so, you know, when we have them through Homeground, is there any evidence, have we built up any evidence around what change, what impact it makes?
It's a very good question. I'm currently in conversation with our government to fund the evaluation of the apartment. So I'll use this as an opportunity to encourage that evaluation. So very, very specifically, we don't have kind of academic or university level evidence yet, Shamubeel, but I'm working my way towards it. What I can tell you, and it's not rocket science, if you can't get to primary health care, which would be many people who have a lot of money are waiting now 2 or 3 weeks to go to a doctor, but just imagine what it's like if you're on the street and you don't have money. So if we weren't providing primary health care here at Homeground, people would be going to the emergency department. Now, what's super interesting is that people who are vulnerably housed or live on the street are often very, very physically unwell. So just imagine what it would be like to be insulin dependent and living on the street. Like, where do you store your insulin? it gets very kind of practical and very pragmatic in the scheme of things. So what we are doing through the provision of primary healthcare is saving our country literally millions of dollars, because people would be turning up to ED, they would be then in hospital and would be having not longer stays than what they're actually needed. And that's what primary healthcare is designed for. But primary healthcare is going the way of housing, that actually it is becoming the privilege of the resourced to actually access primary healthcare quickly in the appropriate time in response to that need. Now, the other really classical experience or example is the police involvement. So it would be very, very common that there is someone who is homeless, who is intoxicated, who therefore is going to be having involvement with the justice system. There are many people, by the way, tonight who are housed and intoxicated in their homes. That would be a relatively common experience in New Zealand. So if you have a home, therefore you are more likely to not be involved in the justice system. And that's probably a bad example, but it is a relatively good one that actually just says that our police are involved with people who are unhoused, often unnecessarily so, but then situations get exasperated and exaggerated that then appropriately do require the justice system. So there's very, very clear evidence from overseas that housing people who were once street homeless actually reduces significantly the cost to both our health and our justice system particularly.
Yeah, thanks, Helen. And I mean, that's the literature from around the world. If you look at the dealing with poverty, I don't know if any of you read Matthew Desmond's book, Poverty by America. Extraordinary book. If you haven't read it, put it on, read it while you've got some Prozac on hand, but absolutely amazing. And I think that's the evidence is it's totally solvable. It doesn't cost that much money. And in fact, it saves you a whole bunch of other money on the other side. You don't have to build prisons and all those other bits and pieces if you deal with the poverty issues. In the comments I saw, there was Natalie Vincent on the call today, and Natalie used to be the CEO of Ngā Tangata Microfinance, is now at Good Shepherd. They've got a great solution around microfinance, and very similar, I think, like the innovation that we're seeing with Sasha. We're trying to provide solutions for people who need it to stop people from falling into these terrible things. Sasha, can you talk to us a little bit about some of the things that are working? Because it's not like we're not standing still, right? There is innovation that's happening.
So I'm now going to give you a 30-second pitch on Sweetspot, really. So we launched 9 months ago. We're the only lender of our type in New Zealand. The one thing we do is help people out of debt. So in that time, in that 9 months, we've helped nearly 700 families out of $30 million worth of high-cost debt. 30 million. And we've helped a further 800 families access free financial education and referrals to community partners. So when we set up, we said that we didn't want to displace good people already doing good things in community. So what's the gap that exists? And the gap that existed was a mechanism for people to get out of debt, but linking that to financial education and support. So in the last 9 months, our customers have also engaged in over 4,000 pieces of financial education. The reason I'm saying that is that that helps people to get out of debt quicker, because what we've said is that takes effort and time, and that should be acknowledged and rewarded. So by engaging in financial education, extra money comes off our customers' loans or into a savings account that for the level of financial resilience for those financial shocks in the future. On top of that, our customers have, our advisor is Kane Karahoma, who's down in Gizzy. And his question to me moons ago was, how can this journey through debt increase people's capacity for generosity? Because if you are in a situation of financial stress, distress, struggling, your capacity to be generous with time, with other resources, how could you link that to debt? So by our families committing to getting out of high-cost debt, completing their financial reset, they get to donate to causes they care about through our partnership with the Good Registry. So acknowledging their ongoing commitment by linking it to something they care about. So that's where we're at in 9 months. And just to kind of loop back around where we started around that judgment, really we're a lender with empathy. That's all it is. Like, what's working? Listen to people. Don't assume their situation. Don't judge. And that's all we're doing differently is empathy. You know, I think one of the things that's making me angry at the moment is some of the narrative around, well, people should just budget better. Really? Is that the way we're going to solve for poverty and people financially struggling? Really? I don't think so. It's the other end of the equation, you know. So I think that the people who have very little are the best people to ask about how to make a little go a long way. So what's working well is that people are working through their debt. We've had people be able to get first home offers through getting out of high cost debt, relocate for better employment opportunities. So I had a lady from Northland that moved down to Auckland with her 6 kids. And it's expensive to relocate, but that's what she did. And she's been able to navigate that movement and get out of debt that she'd been in for a very long time. Because our average interest rate just covers our costs. So what we're trying to show the system is that to say that this is risk-based pricing for a loan, we need to charge 50% because it's high risk. It's bullshit, excuse me, but it is. You can be a sustainable finance organisation. We're not a charity, we're a sustainable finance organisation that can be impactful, where people can move through debt without judgment, harnessing the power of empathy.
That resonates so much with me because as part of a project for MSD, I interviewed a whole bunch of people who had access debt solution services, including from Natalie's Tangata. And what I heard from these people was, you know, they just needed a break. They just needed a break to be able to come out of it, right? That's all it was. And of course, you know, like you said right at the beginning, Sasha, you might fall out again because life happens. It's unpredictable and this stuff happens. And people who are poor will always need more support to be able to bounce back up because they don't have the reserves. But that's where debt and community support and those safety nets can be so helpful. I'm just mindful that we're running out of time, but I'd love to hear from you, Sasha, just an idea on what could we do at the systems level to kind of take these innovations and make them bigger? Because the need that's out there is solvable in New Zealand, but it can't be just you and Natalie and others going off and doing this stuff. We need a bit more of a systems response. Do you have any ideas?
Oh, increase access to capital for people trying to change a financial system rather than being seen weird. That would be something that's epic. Like just as a really quick aside, can you imagine pitching for investment and saying, look, I don't want to be the biggest. We just want to do one thing. We want to do it really well. And if people get out of debt faster, that's a win, isn't it? You know, please give us some money. You know, so I think that at a systems level, I think that I'd like to see some changes around how capital can be allocated for innovation. And I think that I really wish that our legislative environment around financial services wasn't a ping pong game between the political parties, because it's not helping anyone. And whilst they're doing that, we have more and more families struggling, juggling and distressed, and it's just not good enough.
It's a constant frustration for me that there is this extraordinary amount of political divisiveness on issues that really are not that divisive, and they would actually pay dividends for individual society and for the government coffers if we chose to do it right. And, you know, there are some really good examples in the UK where they've used kind of the, you know, the lost money in bank accounts to fund these kinds of affordable credit services. We could do that. We could just use the bond money that's sitting in our tenancy services if we wanted to. There's lots of potential innovations that are possible, but there is a lack of will. Helen, I'm just, again, conscious of time, so I just want to get your ideas. And I know you want to solve the world, but are there some things in addition to, I guess, being more empathetic and government being just a bit more joined up? What are the kinds of practical things that we really need to focus on to move New Zealand forward?
I think there's 2 things that I'd say, and I'm almost just repeating what both you and Sasha have said, and I suspect that the audience here knows, is that the litmus test to everything is the experience of the individual family or individual. So we need to hear and privilege the stories of people or the experience of people. So Sasha's moved when you said before, you know, is that like, here's this assumption around budgeting and debt, but is it really actually? Like, what's really going on? So that is a process of kind of encouraging all of us actually to step beyond our prejudice and actually simply to listen. And then I think to hear, so it's something in that listening and that hearing space. So often the question that I have to ask myself is, what does it take me to hear? And I often have to remove something that happens between the listening and the hearing to actually hear. So I think there's that encouragement. So when I hear that debt is crippling people. So, okay, there's kind of two very simple answers. How do we raise income or manage expenditure? And then how do we deal with the palaver around how debt is coped with? And Sasha, you've spoken beautifully about that today. So and if we did that, then people wouldn't be coming to us for food. And Shamubeel, I was conscious about what you said in the opening about housing. Like, housing really is the deal breaker at the moment, and it is getting better, but oh my gosh, it feels like it's pushing stuff uphill. Is it really that hard? So I think it then takes me back to some probably less practical, but certainly I believe more powerful statements. Please, New Zealand, here. Please, New Zealand, be brave. And please, New Zealand, stop being so afraid. And when we can live in that space, we're all good. Yeah.
Amazing. The reason I love talking to and listening to Helen is because it comes from a place of experience, but with solutions, right? And there is a wider systems issue in terms of if we want to solve the issues that we see in New Zealand, they're actually within our grasp, but we are starting from what's the right question and what's the right motivation. And, you know, my sense is that if you don't start from a position of love, of unconditional love for all New Zealanders, it doesn't work. I sound very preachy here, but I think that's really what it is. When you start blaming people and condemn people to poverty, you will not be able to come out of it because it's all about finger pointing. Look, it's been an absolute privilege to have these two amazing women with me today to talk about, I think, the real experience of what the economy looks like when the economy doesn't work for everybody. The economy should be about lifting more people up. And when you don't do that, there are some serious consequences. And they're individual, they're social, they're fiscal. But we know there are solutions. We've got two women who are delivering it on the front line every single day, and many other people. Thank you so much for joining us today. I encourage you to go and have a look at the City Mission and Money Sweetspot. Please support them anywhere you can, because the more we can amplify these stories and activities, the more New Zealanders will be better off. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, everyone. That was an incredibly passionate and solution-based session, and so thank you for that. The links are in the chat, so go and check those out a bit further and see the ways that you can support. And I will pass it over to our next panel.